Greetings. So, what I want to do in this short talk is to sum up and synthesize and represent the thoughts that I've been having about the pending referendum on Scottish independence. Only this time, rather than talking from a detailed intellectual space, I want to speak more from the heart. And I want to start by sharing a dream I had recently, in the last couple of nights. I dreamt that I was in a house which was on many levels, and it was built around a living tree, a very large tree, like the giant trees of Lothlorien in The Lord of the Rings. And in this house, in the different rooms that were leading off the central tree trunk, were different people all enjoying themselves, and basically there was a party going on. And it was one of those magical parties in the night, with candles burning everywhere, and fairy lights, and people sitting around playing music in different rooms. Some were listening to dance music. There was some dancing in some of the rooms. In other rooms there was acoustic music playing. In others there was poetry readings, conversations, people sharing a glass of wine, and so on. And there was an atmosphere of delight and seriousness and a sense of shared beauty and purpose. Now, each of these different rooms had different clusters of people. Some I recognised from my past and were from all different parts of the United Kingdom. Some were from Wales, some were from Wiltshire, some were from Sussex, some were from Devon, some were from Scotland, some from Ireland, some from London. And they were all mingling and exploring and discussing and debating. And they tasked me with the urgent need to get a message out to the people of Britain who are coming up to this referendum, and to convey the insight that our island, Great Britain, is a very magical place indeed, and it would be foolish to have to choose between which room represents the highest or the purest or the best form of the magic. Each of these rooms is a place of great wonder and great beauty, with tremendously wise people engaging in serious discussion and thought and reverie and musings. And I woke up realising that in a sense I'd been shown a metaphor for the United Kingdom at its best. We share one living tree, one organic interconnectedness. And in each part of this island of Great Britain, including Scotland and all her islands, and Northern Ireland as well, and all the amazing people that have been found scattered throughout the United Kingdom, there are these tremendously wise and wonderful people. Let's call them magicians, because there's no real word in English that can convey the depth of the wisdom of these people. Now, what I feel at the moment in the debate about the referendum is it's been left to, shall we say, politicians and economists. By and large, they're the only people that are really deeply engaged in the debate, at least publicly. And people from different political persuasions, be they socialists or conservatives or liberals or nationalists, have engaged, but really at a political level. And what I want to address in this short talk is something very different. I want to address the soul dimension of this coming referendum and why it's important from, let's say, a magical level. In my reading of history, and I've studied history for many years and have degrees in history and a PhD in history, I've come to realize that the official history that passes for historical knowledge, the history of dynasties and wars and battles and politics and economics is only one part of history. There's another part of history which sometimes is called intellectual history or spiritual history or esoteric history, or in my PhD I coined the phrase transpersonal history. This is the history that deals with the higher natures of human beings, with our imaginal life, with our spiritual life, with our mystical life, and with our soul life. And I believe strongly that there is that dimension to human beings. And it needn't necessarily be expressed in formal religious terms. It needn't be that one subscribes to a particular religious formulation of spiritual existence. But I believe it's there as an ontological reality that each of us is imbued with. This is our capacity for thought, feeling, wonder, appreciation, and love. And in the history of these islands, there have been tremendous thinkers and poets and sages and philosophers and saints who've struggled with and struggled through their own inner journey and have tried to make sense of the difficulties that they face in their generations, and have come through to a place of understanding, of wisdom, of insight, and have then shared that through teaching and through creative work in the arts, in poetry and music, in theatre and so on. And we have in these islands been blessed with a tremendous richness of literature and creative geniuses who've contributed to the sum total of happiness, not just in these islands, but hopefully in the sum total of mankind's collective searching for truth. The advancements made by our political philosophers, our metaphysicians, our theologians, and all the different branches of the social sciences of political thought and so on. Now, this to me has been a collective work that we have been at work on in Britain, and pioneering a compromise approach to politics, to living together, drawing on the best aspects of constitution building, so that we've reached a place where democracy works and yet is also governed by a sense of responsibility and wisdom. Aristotle's idea of the ideal constitution was a mixture of monarchy, aristocracy and democracy. And in a sense we've had that. We've been blessed in the UK to have that, which gives an extra stability, so that we've avoided the kinds of mob rule or hysteria that accompanied the French Revolution or the Nazi era in Germany, where literally street mobs ruled the political process. We've avoided the worst excesses of tyrannical rulers and dictatorial populists such as Mussolini and Hitler and so on, who came to power on the backs of democracies and yet masked their contempt for ordinary people. I think we're at a crossroads in Britain. We need to forge some kind of new constitutional settlement, and we need a fairer Britain, and I would argue we need a more magical Britain that enables our spiritual resources to be brought to bear on the huge problems facing not just our society but the world as a whole. What I think is wrong and flawed about the Scottish nationalist position and the idea of separating Scotland entirely and totally and forever from the United Kingdom is that it's basically arguing that one's Scottish identity transcends one's British identity. I think what is flawed about this is that, by definition, coming to live in a shared community, a country which is comprised of several nations living peacefully together over many centuries, is that we've learned to, although we may be English or Welsh or Scottish or Irish, we've learned to subsume that within a greater sense of identity, a shared common purpose, if you want. And this concept of a wider identity, I think is something very precious that shouldn't be just brushed aside. So, for instance, in England, most English people that I've taught in English schools for many years and lived in London and in different parts of England, both teaching and researching as a scholar. My PhD was from the University of London. I think it's true to say that most people who live in England don't wave the flag of Englishness as a kind of national identity that they canvass as the sole ethical criteria of righteousness. Most English people wear their allegiance to Englishness quite lightly, and they're content to recognise that being born in England means that one has also duties in the wider sphere, and that one's identity as someone in Britain is actually more important. And most people in England either live or have travelled to on holidays, or have friends with, or have intermarried with people from Wales or Ireland or Scotland. And over the centuries, this has been a continual pattern, so that we've reached a point where many Scots live south of the border, many English people live north of the border or live in Wales. Many people from Welsh origin ended up living in England, some in Wales, some in Scotland rather. And so we have the choice to explore and adventure in all these different parts of the country. Now, I think this is a wonderful opportunity that people have. And I'd really be sad to see the United Kingdom broken up, so that we become instead a kind of patchwork of separate national identities. It would seem to me a reversion, as I said in my longer talks, to a kind of balkanisation of the British Isles. And rather than that, I would propose that we recommit to this shared journey that we're on, this shared journey of exploring and fulfilling our identity as citizens of the United Kingdom, and yet making the country work even better. I think some of the aspirations and the concerns of the people of Scotland expressed in the yes vote are important, and the political leaders in the UK have realised that, and in a sense this is why they're suggesting that more power should be devolved. There should be more of a kind of federal settlement. And I think there will be great changes in the UK and its constitution if the no vote wins. I think the no vote should really be no but. No, we're rejecting this narrow Scottish nationalism which seeks to separate and divide and break up the United Kingdom. But we're saying, no, we don't want that, but we do want something better than we have now. We want the genuine concerns of the Scottish nationalists of Plaid Cymru and some of the aspirations of the people of Ireland, and indeed of the regions of England, to be taken into account. And somehow out of that rabbit hat to produce a magical settlement, a re-constitution, a re-covenant, if you want, which commits us to building a country in which all our highest aspirations can be blended, harmonised and fulfilled. And of course I would add here all the more recent immigrant communities who've come to Britain and who enrich our national life with the cultural traditions from Asia and different religious customs and traditions. And you know, we are blessed in a sense as a microcosm of the whole planet. We have, living in our great cities such as London and Glasgow and Manchester and so on, people from probably all the tribes of the earth living in harmony. I think, although it seems attractive, Scottish nationalism as a proposal, I think it comes from a place of lesser magic than the true attempt to cohere together and see this through and to fulfill our real potential as a country. I want to go back to the question of magic, because I feel that, in a sense, the Scottish nationalists have somehow argued or seemed to steal the thunder of the magical option of nationalism. Now, nationalism is always quite a powerful form of magic. It was something that was invoked in the 20th century in Italy by Mussolini and his harking back to the greatness of Italy, and it appealed to many people. Likewise in Germany, German nationalism was invoked strongly in the 1930s and 20s, and this kind of romantic idealism that many German nationalists had before it was perverted and corrupted into the political form of Nazism, which brought such a horror to Europe as a whole. And likewise in France, the early French thinkers who emphasized their Gallic roots and the glory of France became, in a sense, perverted into political nationalism after the French Revolution, into the idea of a revolutionary army that was sweeping across Europe and bringing nationalism in the form of Napoleon's troops to impose this kind of a secular vision of nationalism on the European continent as a whole, which led to tremendous violence. And all these outbreaks of nationalism always led to tremendous violence. We saw it in the Napoleonic Wars era, and we saw it in the 1930s. And I think, attractive though that kind of nationalist option is, the greater maturity, the greater political wisdom, recognises, as Mazzini did in Italy, in the origins of Italian nationalism, that nation states are simply a passage through to a bigger kind of internationalism. He always looked forward to the United States of Europe. He was at heart a federalist. He believed in internationalism, which is a word coined by the English sage Jeremy Bentham, founder of University College. And I think what we should be looking for is the magic within internationalism, transnationalism, and intranationalism. It's always at the cusp where people touch that magic happens. And most of the people I've met in my life have come from all different kinds of interesting mixtures of different ethnicities, different religious interests, different cultural backgrounds. And I think, I myself am part Canadian, British. I've lived in Wales, I've lived in England, I've lived in Scotland. I've travelled to Northern Ireland several times, and Southern Ireland, which I greatly love as well. And all over the world, I've travelled to about 36 countries. So I'm coming at this whole debate very much from an internationalist, or can I say a cosmopolitan perspective. I'm looking at the choices in this referendum and weighing them from a cosmopolitan perspective, and finding the option of narrow nationalism and the destruction of the United Kingdom a retrograde step. Now, of course, it's clothed in a politically correct rhetoric. Scottish nationalists are expert at spouting a kind of politically correct rhetoric, which makes it somehow almost a sin to oppose them, because they have this kind of moral righteousness and piety about them. But I think if you actually really think about it, it's a false piety and it's a false rhetoric, because it's premised on a destructive act. And I think, for me, the highest form of magic comes from love. I'm interested in the traditions of white magic, of love in action. And I think these were exemplified by Christ and by the great saints of the Church. Christ was, in a sense, for me, a druid, a white magician, a magus. This is symbolized by the Magi coming to his birthplace. And what Christ was saying is that whatever the cost, love has to triumph over ethnicity and over tribalism. This was the vision of St. Paul and the early saints of the Church, was to share this great flowering of love that had come upon mankind, like an influx of the Holy Spirit, as they saw it in their own language. And some people have still, to this day, I think that experience is only valid if we actually actualize that in our own lives, if each of us makes that breakthrough into that spiritual kingdom, so to say, of love. And this, I think, was what Christ was talking about when he talked about the kingdom of God. It's the place where love comes to dwell, and is non-judgmental, and is not premised on hate. Christ never taught to hate the Romans, or to hate the Greeks, or to hate the Celts, or to hate the Jews, or to hate the Phoenicians, or to hate the Egyptians. If you read the Gospels very carefully and you read the Gnostic scriptures, you discover that he had students and friends from all those communities, because precisely he'd broken through into a place of unconditional compassion and love. And the Buddhist tradition, the Bodhisattva tradition, talks of the same thing, karuna. The question then that, as a philosopher, I think one has to ask is, what kind of political arrangements can best embody and perfect that kingdom of love on earth? St. Augustine and other theologians have struggled with this for centuries. He talked in a polaristic way of the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man. I think the two are more subtly and complexly intertwined than Augustine believed. I'm with the great Celtic theologian Pelagius, who argued that actually each of us in our lives can recapitulate that vision of unity, and we can build pockets of that enlightened culture. That's the purpose, the true purpose of spiritual wisdom. And that is, in a sense, to raise one's game to the level of the highest and purest form of magic. Now, I think Britain as a country has had many great savants and sages and scholars. I live close to Helensburgh, where Sir James Fraser came from, the author of the Golden Bough, which was one of the great classic treatises on the nature of magic. And he was arguing that in every culture there is this urge to the transcendental, the magical. And so it is in Western cultures, and in my own studies of indigenous traditions in Europe, Roman and Greek religion, Celtic religion, and so on, I find a commonality there. If you go, as I have, to the sacred sites of Greece, to Delphi and Eleusis, or the sacred sites of the Celtic world, Tara and Ireland, and the places near Kilmartin, Dunad, and all the great centres of Celtic wisdom, I think you find that same energy. In Britain, Stonehenge and the Wessex culture were very important, and in my own work as a Druid, I was bequeathed the Peace Sword of Britain at a ceremony in Avebury back in 2007, and sit on the Council of British Druid Orders, and have been dealing with people from all over Britain who continue that magical witness to the sacredness of these islands. Now, these islands have not always been a political whole. Obviously, in ancient times, there were tribal divisions, partly on language, partly on political grounds. But I think the Druids always knew that this island is one magical place. It's a field for the actualization of our highest dreams. And places like Stonehenge and Avebury were great temples risen up, where people would come as pilgrims from all over the whole of the islands of Britain. Same with Newgrange in Ireland, and the same with the great spiritual pilgrimage centres in Orkney, in Scotland. So I think we have much more in common at that deep magical level than people realise. And so what I'm really saying to the people of Britain, and the people of Scotland in particular, is what we should be doing in this referendum is reaffirming that interconnectedness. Rather than going for the simplistic nationalist agenda of emphasising this against that, and this ridiculous kind of anti-English rhetoric that's there, and this opposition to Westminster. It's a kind of gut reaction that Alex Salmond and some of these Scottish politicians seem to have. I think, with all due respect, it's quite a childish and immature kind of politics. If you go into Alex Salmond's biography, as I have, and try to understand what makes the man tick in his psychohistory, which is a field I studied for my PhD, you find that actually this is a man who was proud of never going to England until he was quite old. He was brought up with stories of how horrible the English were, and he was brought up with the kind of fantasy that because he was born on the birthday of Bonnie Prince Charlie, the 31st of December, he was going to kind of complete the work Bonnie Prince Charlie had failed. So right from an early age, he's had one idea in his head, which is basically to smash the Union and to elevate Scottish nationalists into a position of total power, effectively. And with all due respect, I think this is a very low form of magic. It's destructive, and it's actually antithetical to reality, because reality is about interconnectedness, and love is about interconnectedness. The magic of destruction and opposition and hatred stems from the opposite of love. It's about tearing down and breaking things up. So next year we're going to be holding a meeting of the Bards of Britain in Stratford-on-Avon, near where my father came from in Warwickshire. And there are many chairs of bards now established in places throughout Britain. And the bards always worked closely with the druids. They were the keepers of the magic, the reciters of the poetry, the musicians. In my understanding of Britain, what truly makes us great is not our economy, although it's a powerful and important economy. And it's not just our science, even though we have some of the greatest scientists in history who've lived and worked in these islands and still do. What makes us truly great is the capacity for wonder, beauty, and love that we can attain. And here I'm referring to the great poetic traditions, which are there in the Celtic writings of Ireland and Scotland and Wales, in the early bardic traditions of Taliesin, and the very first kind of writings in Gaelic in Ireland that were brought then by Gaelic people coming to Scotland, and that blended then into the great English writings, which gave us Beowulf and the Anglo-Saxon poems, and then gave us this miracle of literature which these islands are famous for, and gave us figures such as Shakespeare, who blended magically all those currents. And in his plays he wrote about Scotland, he wrote about Italy, he wrote about ancient Britain and King Lear, and he had a kind of polymathic Renaissance mind, which I think is really what's at stake in this referendum. Are we going to turn our back on the white magic of the bardic tradition, which I think is exemplified by Shakespeare, and he's rightly known as the Bard of Britain? Are we going to turn our back on that legacy? And don't forget that his patron, Queen Elizabeth I, it was, who bequeathed her throne to King James of Scotland. She trusted in the people of Scotland and the monarch of Scotland to hold that torch, to carry on that work that her amazing court, the Renaissance court of Elizabeth, had started. And it's interesting that when King James was crowned, very latest forensic scholarship has proved that Shakespeare, the actor and playwright, actually helped carry the coronation robe of King James as he was coming to be crowned in London. That's a symbolic thing, that what was going on there was that magic of the Renaissance Elizabethan court was then embracing and welcoming Scottish traditions, which were themselves a form of powerful magic. We have in Scotland Rosslyn Chapel, we have many alchemists who were working in medieval Scotland and who were conscious practitioners, shall we say, of Christian higher magic, of alchemical thought, and were aware of the importance of spirit and the importance of ethics and ethical goodness as the foundation of our lives. The true magician works with God as the foundation and centre of their work. And that tradition then blended the two cultures of the English and the Scottish traditions. Now, esoteric groups like Freemasonry and so on have partly exemplified that, and that's why I think they flourish so much in Britain, in Scotland and England, and then spread to America and Canada and Australia and so on, and to Europe. But in a sense, those are simply attempts to give formal structure to what is essentially an attitude of soul, a place of wonder and being spellbound by the beauty of existence. One of the greatest philosophers of the Middle Ages, Duns Scotus, came from Scotland and wrote of the nature of being and how God is embedded in the very structure, the essence of existence itself, transcending religion or creed or class or language or tribe. He was one of those universal thinkers, second only to Thomas Aquinas in his contribution to the complexities of medieval thought. Another great Scottish philosopher was Michael Scott, who was known as a magician, who spent time in Sicily and Italy at the court of the emperor and worked as his astrologer and magician, but also translated Aristotle and tried to blend the works of the great Greek pagan thinkers like Aristotle with Christian and esoteric currents of thought. This, to me, is the great work that we as a people are embarked on in Britain. And I'd hate to see it truncated. One writer has said that for Scotland to leave would be like to decapitate Britannia. To me, Britannia as a whole is like a goddess. The whole island, if you look at the form, is like a goddess seated on her throne like Isis. And to take off the top bit is literally a decapitation. To me, Ben Nevis, the crown chakra of the island, is literally the kind of, the third eye or the crown chakra of the goddess herself. And I think it's quite symbolic that Keats, the poet, went on a trip up to Ben Nevis, and many of the great romantic poets came to Scotland and were awed by the beauty of Scotland, and still are to this day. That's why I've come to live here. I was drawn by the beauty of the landscape, the lochs, the mountains, the light, the magic that you sense here. Figures like Thomas the Rhymer and the whole rich mythology embedded in the Scottish landscape. This is part, I think, of the heritage of all British people, and actually, in a sense, predates the coming of the Gaels. This was already deep in the landscape of what came to be called Scotland before the Irish ever set foot on these shores, bringing with them the term Scot or Scottish. So what I'm talking about is a very, very deep magic, an ancient magic that goes right back to the peoples who built Stonehenge and Avebury and Orkney and the Ring of Brodgar and the whole panoply of ancient wisdom sites. If you travel in Wiltshire and go to places like Wayland's Smithy or Silbury Hill, you can resonate, you can tune in to these ancient wisdom people. And what I found, I can only share this humbly and with love, is that there was a commonality, there was an ancient wisdom tradition in these islands, which the greatest Christian mystics like Columba and the great philosophers like Duns Scotus and Michael Scott, they also knew about. They resonated with it. This is why Columba said, look, Christ is my druid. He was a healer, a spiritual teacher, a man of peace, and a bringer of the fire of the knowledge of God. This is what Christ was saying when he said, I've come to bring fire to the world. What that fire is the knowledge of higher wisdom. The same fire that Prometheus sought to bring to mankind. It's the same story. And that fire is still needed. That's what we need, in a sense, to judge wisely in this referendum vote. And in Christian language, the Holy Spirit was seen as a fire that descends upon the one who has patience and faith. I think what we need in this election is patience and faith. We have to really think at a deep level about why our souls are here in this island, why we chose to incarnate into the United Kingdom, into this tremendously rich lineage. And I think we should pause and step back from the act of severance, and we should choose love and integrity, what Ken Wilber calls the integral path, where we recognise the polydimensionality of all states of being, and we achieve a kind of enlightenment experience which appreciates, values, and affirms all the different states of consciousness and being that we can experience as human beings, and appreciates the wholeness that runs through them all. This is the true meaning of universalism, or Catholicism to use the Greek word, which sees things in their holistic perspective. So I think my message, simply in a nutshell, I mean, I've explained in much greater detail in my longer talks, but in a nutshell, my final kind of plea really to the people of Scotland, the people of the northern shores here where I dwell, is to choose love, which is to choose wholeness and integrity, and the reaffirmation that all parts of this magical island are interconnected. I mean, it's very interesting, the Welsh leader, Carmen Jones, has come out strongly urging the Scots to please not leave the Union. The English leaders have said the same. The further afield, people involved with the Commonwealth, the Prime Ministers of Canada and Australia have also said to the people of Scotland, please, don't break up the UK. We love the UK. It's our mother country. In Canada, where I come from, there are people from all over the United Kingdom who contributed hugely to that country's amazing, rich texture of cultural heritages. And who are we to choose which is the most important? The English or the Welsh or the Scots, they all have played their role in, I think, ultimately, in bearing witness to the spirit and how the spirit unfolds through the patterns of history. I mean, I'm a great fan, as you know, of history and the philosophy of history, but in the writings of people like Gibbon and Toynbee, these kind of universalist historians, and in my own PhD, I've tried to find tracks and traces of how history bears the imprint, as von Ranke, the great German historian, who was a relative of Robert Graves, another great historian and scholar of Irish descent, in his book The White Goddess, tried to point out. And that magical tracery that we can find in the affairs of our cultural unfolding, I think is what our country's all about. And ultimately it comes from love. And we should therefore, I think, reaffirm that love. But there are things to improve, and we can all do our bit in making this a fairer, a wiser, a more beautiful and a more magical country. But first we have to say no to the narrow vision, the beheading. It's ironic that people are being beheaded in the Middle East at the moment by very narrow-thinking people who have a very narrow interpretation of their own religious ideology and also their narrow nationalism. They're trying to build this new little state, a kind of rogue state in the Middle East, which flouts the rules of international law and international morality. And the international community's right to oppose that and to take measures to make sure that threat goes away. But in a parallel way, I'd say the kind of beheading of Britain is as tragic, a kind of symbolic, metaphorical separation. And I think that also needs opposing. The only way we can do that is with love and with knowledge and with the power of the Holy Spirit and with the flame of Gnosis, which is the heritage of all of us in these islands. And I would plead to the people of Scotland not to raise that sword and decapitate Britannia, but rather reaffirm the integrity of the goddess as a whole, and reset our sights on fulfilling that vision that have been bequeathed to us by the peoples of all the parts of these islands. And so may wisdom guide your choice, and I look forward to the outcome in hope and fear and trembling, as Kierkegaard said. But I strongly hope that we choose the path of light and the path of love and the path of wisdom. Thank you.